Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today into how Hungarians are viewing the Russia-Ukraine war 3 years on from when it all began.
Yeah, 3 years is a long time.
Yeah, it really is. And to help us get a clearer picture, we're turning to a survey conducted just recently by the Publicus Institute.
Between March 5th and 11th, to be exact.
Right, just earlier this month. Now, this survey was commissioned by Népszava, and it polled 1,000 Hungarian adults. So we're looking at some pretty solid data here.
It gives us a good sense of where things stand.
Our mission today, I guess you could say, is to really grasp the key perspectives and feelings within Hungary about this ongoing conflict.
Yeah, based on what this survey tells us.
So we're going to dig into what Hungarians think about Russia's actions, their own government stance, the Trump-Zelensky meeting that everyone was talking about and how that might affect U.S. support and, ultimately how they think this war should end.
What's in it for Hungary, so to speak?
Yeah, exactly. What's best for Hungary and for Europe as a whole. And I'll tell you, the way these opinions break down is pretty fascinating, maybe even a little surprising at times.
Definitely. It's a lot more nuanced than a simple black and white picture.
For sure. Okay, so let's jump right in. First up, how are Hungarians actually viewing Russia's actions at this point, 3 years in?
All right, well, the survey says that 62% consider Russia's attack on Ukraine an act of aggression.
So a pretty clear majority there.
Yeah, a majority, but interesting to note that this is actually down a bit from 64% back in March 2022, right at the start of the war.
Huh. So right at the outset, sentiment was even a little stronger against Russia?
It seems so, yeah.
Yeah.
But when you delve deeper and look at the breakdown by political affiliation, that's where things get really revealing.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit.
Sure. So for Democratic coalition voters, they're a social liberal opposition party. A full 100% view it as aggression.
Wow. Completely unified on that point.
Then with Kitsa Party voters, that's another opposition party, it's 94%. So very similar.
Makes sense. Both opposition parties sharing a similar perspective.
Right. But then, for those who identify as uncertain voters, the number drops all the way to 55%.
Oh, that's quite a dip.
And then, among Fidesz voters, the ruling party, it's only 35%.
That's a huge difference.
It is. It shows how political leanings are really influencing how people see the very nature of this conflict.
You have to wonder how much of that is down to the information they're exposed to, the narratives they're hearing.
Right. The media they consume, the politicians they listen to, it all plays a role.
So on the other side of the coin, we have the 21% who view Russia's attack as more of a defensive action.
An interesting perspective, and that's actually up from 15% back in March 2022.
So who's more likely to see it this way?
Well, unsurprisingly, 68% of Mihazank voters, that's a far-right nationalist party, consider it defense.
Okay, so leaning more towards the Russian narrative, you could say.
Then a big chunk of Fidesz voters, 43%, also hold this view.
Interesting. So there's definitely a split within Fidesz on this issue. Not as unified as the other parties we discussed.
Right. It's not a monolithic view within the party.
And what about those uncertain voters?
18% of them lean toward the defensive interpretation.
Okay, so still a sizable portion.
And just a tiny 3% of Tisa party voters see it this way.
So the lines are pretty clearly drawn on that point.
Absolutely. It really highlights how divided Hungarian society is in understanding how this conflict even started.
It's fundamental, right? It shapes everything else.
Absolutely.
All right, let's shift gears a little and talk about the Hungarian government's stance. The survey found that a slight majority, 52%, think Orbán Viktor should be tougher on Russia.
Condemn their actions more forcefully, yeah.
And that number is actually up from 43% back in March 2022.
So people are wanting a stronger response as time goes on.
What do you think is behind that shift?
Well, it's probably a mix of things. The war dragging on, the human cost becoming more and more apparent.
People may be feeling like it's time to take a moral stand.
Right. But also, the rise of the Tisa party likely plays a role. They're pretty pro-Western and critical of Russia.
And according to the data, 90% of Tisa party voters and 84% of DK voters want Orbán to be more forceful in his condemnation of Russia.
Exactly. That's a big chunk of the opposition right there. Even among the uncertain voters, 44% agree.
So it's not just limited to those firmly opposed to the government?
No, it goes beyond that. But of course, only 17% of Fidesz voters share that view.
So Orbán's base is largely sticking with him on this.
They're happy with the cautious approach.
Okay, let's talk about that Trump-Zelensky meeting in Washington. It seems everyone was talking about it, and the survey shows that 95% of respondents knew about it.
Not surprising. It was all over the news.
Yeah. And then there was that reported tension between the two. The survey asked who was more responsible for that.
And 40% pointed the finger at Trump and J.D. Vance.
Mostly TISA party voters, it seems. 73% of them saw it that way.
Makes sense, given their stance on the U.S. role in all this.
Right. They probably see a shift in U.S. policy as a real concern.
32% of uncertain voters also put more blame on the U.S. side, which is interesting.
Shows how uncertainty doesn't necessarily equal neutrality, I guess.
Definitely not. And then only 2% of Fidesz voters had that perspective.
So they're sticking with Trump, it seems.
It appears so.
What about those who thought Zelensky was more responsible?
Well, 34% overall felt that way.
And unsurprisingly, a huge 80% of Fidesz voters were in that camp.
Along with 41% of Miyazaki voters. So another sign of their leaning towards Russia.
Right. And even 29% of the uncertain voters felt the same.
Showing again how that uncertain category can be quite complex.
And then on the opposite end, only 14% of TISA party voters thought Zelensky was more to blame.
Interesting how these perceptions really mirror the political divides we've been talking about.
It's really telling. Now, 16% thought both sides were equally responsible, maybe saw it as a clash of personalities or something.
Or priorities, perhaps. Different goals, different approaches.
And then a tiny 2% thought neither was really at fault, just a difficult situation.
Right. Sometimes it's just circumstance.
Okay, so let's talk about the elephant in the room, so to speak. What if the U.S. decides to cut back its support for Ukraine? Or even ends it completely? This is a big question mark hanging over everything.
It is, and the survey shows that nearly half of Hungarians think this would actually lead to a quicker end to the war.
But potentially with Ukraine losing some territory, right?
Yeah, that's the trade-off, it seems.
So a quicker end, but not necessarily a victory for Ukraine.
Exactly. And it's interesting to see how the numbers break down here.
Miyazaki voters are the most convinced of this outcome, with 60% thinking it'll happen.
Then Fidesz voters at 50%, and then uncertain voters at 47%.
So a lot of people across the political spectrum think U.S. support is keeping the war going longer.
It seems so. But it's worth noting that 42% of TISA party voters also agree.
That's quite a few, considering they're usually more pro-Ukraine.
Right, but maybe they're just being realistic about the potential consequences.
Maybe they see U.S. support as essential, even if they don't like all the implications.
Yeah, maybe so.
But of course, not everyone's on board with that idea of a quick end if the U.S. pulls back.
No, 25% think the war will just drag on regardless.
And who's most likely to think that?
Well, 40% of Miyazaki voters and 39% of TISA party voters believe that.
So even among those who see Russia's actions as more defensive, there's a belief that the conflict might just continue.
It seems so, yeah.
And then 22% of uncertain voters feel the same, and just 8% of Fidesz voters. So most Fidesz voters are pretty confident that the war will wrap up quickly without U.S. support.
It appears so.
And then there's a smaller group, 8%, who think it could be even more drastic, that Ukraine could actually collapse entirely without U.S. backing.
So, a pretty bleak outlook, but it shows the range of anxieties people have about this situation.
Absolutely. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about what Hungarians think is in their own country's best interest. The survey tells us that almost 60% think the most important thing is just to end the war quickly, regardless of who comes out on top.
Prioritizing peace above all else.
Right, just wanting it to be over.
And this view is really strong across the political spectrum. 85% of Fidesz voters feel that way, 75% of Miyazaki voters.
So both of those groups really want stability above everything else.
Yeah. 53% of uncertain voters agree, and then 36% of TISA party voters and even 44% of DK voters.
So, even among those who might be more sympathetic to Ukraine, there's a significant number who just want the fighting to stop.
It's understandable, given how disruptive this war has been for everyone.
Of course. But then there's about 20% who think Hungary should be pushing for Ukraine to be able to defend its independence and territory as a condition for ending the war.
So not just peace at any cost, but a just peace.
Exactly. And this view is strongest among TISA party voters at 33% and DK voters at 28%.
They're really putting an emphasis on Ukraine's right to self-determination.
And 17% of uncertain voters feel the same way.
But for Mihazank and Fidesz voters, those numbers are much lower, at 8% and 6% respectively.
So there's a clear division on that point.
Yeah, different priorities.
And we should also mention that 14% specifically prioritize Ukraine defending its independence as the condition for the war's end, but without necessarily emphasizing territorial integrity.
Right, so maybe a bit more open to some territorial concessions.
That seems to be more popular with DK and TISA party voters at 24% and 23% respectively.
Again, showing their focus on Ukraine's autonomy, but maybe with a pragmatic approach.
All right, so now let's zoom out a bit and look at what Hungarians think is best for Europe as a whole. Interestingly, 42% think Europe's main interest is also in a quick end to the war, no matter the outcome.
So mirroring the sentiment about Hungary's interests.
Exactly, a lot of consistency there.
And again, it's Fidesz voters at 68% and Mihazank voters at 50% who feel most strongly about this.
Stability first, it seems.
Yeah, get things back to normal as soon as possible.
41% of uncertain voters agree, followed by 23% of TISA party voters and 21% of DK voters. So even among those who might be more hawkish on Russia, there's a recognition that Europe has a lot to gain from peace.
Especially with the economic consequences we've been seeing.
Right, it's been a tough few years.
But of course, 27% think Europe's main priority should be ensuring that Ukraine can defend its independence and territory before the war ends.
So again, not just any peace, but a just peace.
And that view is strongest among TISA party and DK voters, at 45% and 43% respectively.
And then 22% of uncertain voters feel the same way, along with 17% of Mihazank voters and 13% of Fidesz voters. So a solid minority holding that perspective.
Yeah, definitely not insignificant.
And 19% specifically want Europe to prioritize Ukraine's independence without necessarily mentioning territorial integrity.
Again, potentially a bit more flexible on those territorial issues.
And we see a bit of a spread across the political spectrum there.
27% of DK voters, 26% of TISA party voters, 25% of Mihazank voters, and then 18% of uncertain voters.
And 12% of Fidesz voters, so they're not completely absent from that view either. So what happens if the U.S. does actually pull back its support? Should Europe follow suit?
Well, the survey asked Hungarians about that very scenario, and a pretty significant 43% said, yes, Europe should also stop supporting Ukraine.
Wow, so they're really tying Europe's actions to what the U.S. does.
Yeah, very much so.
And predictably, it's Mihazank and Fidesz voters who feel most strongly about this. 92% of Mihazank voters and 82% of Fidesz voters want Europe to cut off support if the U.S. does. So they're not willing to go it alone, so to speak.
They want to stick with the U.S. 44% of uncertain voters also agree with that approach.
But only 11% of TISA party voters share that view, so they're much more committed to supporting Ukraine, regardless of what the U.S. does.
Right, they're in it for the long haul.
And then 25% think Europe should actually step up its support if the U.S. withdraws.
Trying to fill the gap.
Exactly. And that's a view held mostly by TISA party and DK voters at 56% and 35% respectively.
Committed to the cause.
And only 16% of uncertain voters and 5% of Fidesz voters feel the same way. So a pretty stark contrast there.
It really shows the different priorities and levels of concern about Russia.
Okay, one final thing to cover. How worried are Hungarians about their own country being dragged into this war?
Especially if international support for Ukraine dries up completely.
Right, that's the big fear.
Well, 19% think the risk would definitely increase if both the U.S. and Europe stopped backing Ukraine.
And that's mostly DK and TISA party voters at 44% and 34% respectively.
They're probably worried about regional instability, Russia getting bolder.
It's understandable.
Then there's 14% who think the risk would actually decrease if support ended.
So they're thinking a quick end to the war, even with a Ukrainian defeat, would actually be safer for Hungary in the long run.
Yeah, less chance of things escalating. And it's mainly Mihazank and Fidesz voters who think that way at 35% and 25% respectively. But the majority, 53%, think the risk would stay pretty much the same, regardless of what happens with international support.
So no real change in their assessment.
And that's a view shared by 58% of Fidesz voters, 52% of uncertain voters, and 52% of TISA party voters.
Okay, last but not least, let's touch on the personal impact of all this. The survey asked Hungarians how anxious or afraid they feel because of the war happening so close by.
Yeah, that proximity must weigh on people's minds.
22% said they feel very afraid or anxious, and another 22% said they feel somewhat afraid or anxious.
So a significant portion of the population is definitely feeling the stress.
It's interesting to compare that to back in October 2022. Back then, 19% felt very afraid, and 31% felt somewhat afraid.
So it seems like the number who feel very afraid has actually gone up a little.
Yeah, which is interesting considering the war's been going on for longer.
Maybe it's the uncertainty of what might happen next, with the potential for U.S. support to change.
And it's mainly DK voters, Fidesz voters, and uncertain voters who are feeling the most fear at 32%, 30%, and 25% respectively.
So a mix of political views there.
But only 10% of TISA party voters said they felt very afraid.
Maybe they're more optimistic about Ukraine's chances, or maybe they just feel less directly threatened.
It's hard to say, but on the flip side, 40% of Hungarians now say they feel no fear or anxiety at all about the war.
That's up from 30% back in October 2022.
So, a pretty significant increase.
Yeah, it seems like some people are just getting used to the situation, or maybe they've just managed to compartmentalize it.
And that group includes 44% of TISA party voters, 41% of uncertain voters, 31% of Fidesz voters, and 28% of DK voters.
So again, a pretty broad spread across the political spectrum.
All right, so as we wrap up our deep dive into Hungarian public opinion, it's clear that there are a lot of different perspectives on the Russia-Ukraine war, even 3 years in.
Absolutely. It's a very complex picture.
Most Hungarians still see Russia's actions as aggression, but there are some real divisions on how the conflict should be handled, what role the Hungarian government should play, and what might happen if international support for Ukraine changes.
Yeah, we've seen those divisions play out in the survey results, and they often reflect the existing political fault lines within Hungary.
Some people just want the war to end as quickly as possible, while others think it's important for Ukraine to be able to defend its sovereignty and territory.
And there are different levels of anxiety about the potential risks for Hungary itself, especially if the U.S. and Europe stop backing Ukraine.
All in all, it's a fascinating snapshot of a nation grappling with a major conflict right on its doorstep.
And it raises some important questions about how these different viewpoints might shape Hungary's actions going forward.
So, to our listeners, we'll leave you with this thought. How do you think Hungary's relationship with the war will evolve in the coming months and years? And how will these different perspectives within Hungarian society influence their government's decisions? It's a complex situation with no easy answers, and it's something we should all be paying attention to.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
See you next time.